Today we're interviewing John Yearwood, world editor for the Miami Herald, for our segment on Media Matters, the interview series on ApollonEjournal.org. My name is Joseph Nance, and I'm a communication and business major, and today I have with me two other interviewees.
I'm Charlotte Hamilton, a psychology political science double major.
I am Olivia Welch, and I am a peace and social justice major. What formative event in your life led to your career in journalism?
I don't think it was a formative event as such. It was, I grew up in the Caribbean, and one of the things that I did was I liked reading comic books, and one of the characters in the Archie comics, Archie was a reporter, and I always thought that was really cool, and that sort of started me thinking about this may be something that I want to do, and I don't know, I was like 10, 11 years old.
Do you see any differences in Caribbean journalism that you grew up with and the U.S. journalism that you write now?
Yeah, in fact, there are a lot. One of the things, and then I'm involved in a couple of different organizations, including the International Press Institute, and try to work with Caribbean journalists to help increase the standard of journalism, increase ethics, and among other things. So those are a couple of the areas where we've seen some change, where there are some differences. But for the most part, when it comes to writing a story or recording a story for broadcast, there are tremendous differences there. But the whole idea of how you gather the information and present it, that's where we've seen some changes.
I'm glad you brought up the different organizations that you're involved in, because I found that in 1997 you became the founding publisher-editor for IBS, or IBIS.
IBIS.
Yeah, and I was curious as to what caused you to start a magazine so close to home.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had worked for a decade in the U.S. For the Dallas Morning News, and when I left Trinidad, I was pretty young, around 11, and I had been back several times, and I always wondered what it would be like to actually work there and in effect do what I love. So I decided to go off and do it, and it was some of the most fun I've ever had in my life. Doing a magazine, it was a general lifestyle magazine. We reported on everything from politics to travel, and we met and interviewed a lot of the important people down there, from the Prime Minister on down. And it was really, as one of my friends said at the time, it was sort of an intoxicating experience, and I recommend it to everyone. And I'm really glad I did.
Very interesting.
Okay, let's talk about the notion of peace building for a bit. That's something that you speak on quite a bit, as I've done a little research on you. So how do you see the media and journalism, more specifically, as an effective vehicle for the topic of peace building?
Well, I think I see it on two levels. One, individual journalists, as well as the whole umbrella, the organization of journalism. Excuse me. And I'll talk first about how journalists can do it. One of the things that I'm involved in is with the United Nations, and we've been doing for a decade now student leadership summits around the world, and we get young people and we talk to them about, in effect, saving the world. And as part of that, we talk about the importance of peace building, and because we think that's critical. If there will be no world to save if people don't find a way to breach their differences and come together. So that's one way that I think more journalists being involved individually in organizations like those and efforts like those, I think, can go a long way to fostering peace. But more broadly, in journalism, I think in the work that we do, we can write about these issues. Last weekend, I mentioned I was in Boca. I was up interviewing the former Israeli Prime Minister, Yearwood, and that's a big part of what he and I were talking about, the whole idea of peace in the Middle East. And in doing that, I'll be doing a report about that in the Miami Herald soon. But I think the more that we do, the more we we take time to look at these issues and report on these issues, I think the more people are become engaged in looking at, in some cases, how they can play a part in helping to bring peace. And then when you look at bringing peace, it isn't something that we can all do, on a really big scale. There's some little things that people can do to bring peace in their own small ways, and there are a number of things that and when we talk to the young people, we tell them, we talk in a grand sense about saving the world, but it really in effect starts on your own block.
You spoke about the young people and students earlier also. So as young North Americans, what can we do as a whole to, what do you and your colleagues do to seek to inform and enhance our understandings? And what can we do to help foster peace?
Well, I think one of the things that you can do is, one, getting to know your neighbor, getting to know your friends, making friends, even trying to make friends around the world, because and I travel around the world quite a bit, and there's, even a tremendous ignorance out there in terms of people really knowing who we are, and the same thing with us, really knowing who other people are in different parts of the world. There's that disconnect sometimes. And the more we try to get young people together, and that's one of the things that we do through these UN programs, is try to bring young people from different parts of the world together. In fact, we're planning a major summit at the United Nations coming up in 2 years. And right now we're having regional summits around the world in preparation for the big one. But what we're trying to do is really to try to bring people together so that people can get to know each other, they can understand each other, they can talk to each other, and even party together. And in doing that, people can really get a sense of who we are, and hopefully, we can start, in small ways to help bring peace.
I'm curious to hear the story about Mr. Weiss and his detainment, and also to get your take on what steps that the media can take to ensure the safety of journalists in these crisis-laden areas.
Well, I happened to have been in Toronto about a week or so, I guess, before Jim was taken, and I'm in charge of the North American Committee for IPI, and we had a big meeting up there of a couple dozen foreign editors from newspapers and television and radio from around the US and Canada. And one of the things that, interestingly enough, we were talking about is, what do you do when your journalist gets taken by the government, and whether that was, and we were thinking actually focusing more on the Middle East, because in Syria and other places, because that's what's really hot right now. I had no idea that in just a few days I'd be dealing with the same situation. What happened with Jim is that he went into Venezuela. He's based in Colombia. He went into Venezuela through the border. He sort of drove, I think he actually walked across the border. He did not have a visa, but he's really not needed a visa. And you don't need a visa from America to go there, although the Venezuelan government say if you're coming to report, you need to apply for a visa, but no one really does. In any event, he was doing a story about the food traffic that's going across the border because of the problems in Venezuela, where there are very, very many things on the store shelves, and some people are abusing this traffic back and forth. So he went to the town of San Cristobal to report on that, and he wanted to get some statistics, and it just so happens that someone said, go to the military command. They have more statistics because they've been collecting that. And he went in, and it took an inordinate amount of time for him to see the person in charge. And eventually, instead of asking questions of the people there, they started asking him questions about how he got into Colombia. Does he know does he need a visa? He needed a visa, and I think part of it is that it's that area is an opposition area, and secondly, about a year or maybe 2 years before, one of the biggest narco traffickers have been arrested in that area, so they're super sensitive there, and so they they didn't know that he, or didn't care to know that he was a journalist, and if they did know, they just wanted to detain him anyway. So that's what happened. They picked him up, and they, after one day in San Cristobal, they transported him to Caracas, and meanwhile, when we found out about it, we started calling everyone, from members of Congress on down, and eventually I went down to try to see if I could, one, locate him, and two, try to get him out, and I'm happy to say that I was successful in both counts.
I would like to move the conversation to Egypt to talk about the same thing and the recent passing of libel laws and laws barring conversations with terrorist groups that have been passed in Egypt in recent times. Muslim Brotherhood. Journalists are being detained every day for having conversations with terrorist groups, be it in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood or in Iran with the Taliban and things like that. And so these libel laws are kind of impeding the conversations and investigative journalism. And I was wondering what your take is on that, and if there's any approach that can be made to kind of rectify that situation.
Well, that's a big problem that we're seeing around the world, is these libel laws. IPI, which I mentioned before, is really involved in a major campaign. Right now we're working in the Caribbean, and we've had some success there trying to get some of these laws, particularly as it relates to defamation, off the books. We just had an emergency delegation go to Egypt. But what we were talking about, and what we were working on in Egypt, not as much we weren't as concerned about the laws there, because we have a more urgent issue there in that, and you mentioned Al Jazeera, but we have several Al Jazeera journalists have been arrested, and in fact were put up for trial. So we wanted first and foremost to get those guys out of prison. And so that's why one of the main reasons why we're there. But getting back to these libel laws, I think it's really critical that a number of countries around the world that have them should get them off the books, especially the ones that relates to defamation, because you should not report under the threat of going to jail for either what you report or what you say as a journalist. I mean, there are a number of ways that you can take care of that. One of which is you or your company can be sued in civil court, so they can take you to court, and if you're found guilty, you can have to pay a large amount of money civilly. But working under the threat of going to jail is something that no journalist should have to do.
You're talking about stories that are difficult to cover, and so I'd like to ask you, both personally and professionally, what is the hardest story that you've had to cover?
Well, needless to say, I have not literally covered a story as such in a long time in terms of being out reporting. Let me qualify that, actually, because I think about it, actually, I have been out doing some stories, in fact, last weekend. I don't normally go out and cover stories. When I travel, I'm often meeting with leaders and important people in various countries, so that we can have, in many cases, off-the-record conversations about what's happening. But by far, the most significant and the hardest story that I've had to cover, and I know that because I was coordinating our coverage of the Haitian earthquake. And I also went to Haiti during that period, a few days after the earthquake, to help coordinate our coverage there and work and getting our staffs in, getting the reporters in, getting them out. But the Haiti earthquake was just a massive undertaking to cover, and the Miami Herald covered perhaps more than anyone else in terms of all the reporters we've had who went through, and the reams and reams of copy that we wrote about the earthquake. And and to some extent, I still go back to Haiti. I was, in fact, I was last there last year, and no doubt I'll be going back in the next few months.
Okay, now obviously you do a lot of traveling, and when you're in the field or you're performing these investigative actions, you're meeting all of these people. What are some things that you or your colleagues do? What are some things that you see being done to ensure that the actions that you are taking when you're in these foreign countries are not disruptive? They're peaceable, and do you take any sort of actions to work with these people, or do you go in as a foreigner and just report? So how do you ensure that the actions you are taking are peaceable?
Well, there's something that's called parachute journalism, and a lot of people frown on that because it's when something big happens. And I mentioned Haiti, and luckily for us at the Miami Herald, we've covered Haiti. We've been covering Haiti, for decades, well before the earthquake. And just when the earthquake happened, we went into, in effect, what we call flood the zone kind of mode, where we sent everyone and sort of covered it. But there are big stories in Haiti being one of them, where you get reporters coming in who haven't been to Haiti before. Some of them don't even know where Haiti is, and they come in, and some of them can be, and we've had reports about this. They can be disruptive in terms of how they come in and report, and quite frankly, sometimes there've been some criticism that some of these reporters come in at times like a bull in a china shop, thinking that they, whatever they want, they get, and they sort of march through, in effect, and then they leave, and leave without, whatever happened, and then move on to the next crisis. And it just gets to your question in terms of how do you go in and feel that, you've done justice to not only to the story but to the people that you're reporting on. And that's what one of the things we try to do is not just go places, particularly in the Caribbean and Latin America at one time, but having consistent coverage, and that's really, really critical. And then even beyond covering the crisis, one of the things that I tell my reporters a lot who are, reporting from whether it's, the Caribbean or reporting from Latin America specifically, is, tell me how people are living their lives. Don't just report on the crises that are the crises of the day. I want to know, if you're covering, as Jim does, he covers the Andes, what's happening? How are people living in the Andes? So as a result, he does stories about, farmers being able to grow coffee again. And then, he's also writing a lot about what's going on there with the Civil War. But he's also writing about the fact that these donkey carts on the streets of Bogota are about to go away. He's writing about people who are doing graffiti, which actually have to be one of our more popular stories. But he writes, people sort of painting graffiti around the city. But so if you tell the full story and you cover it in a holistic way, then you sort of inoculate yourself somewhat from that kind of criticism that you're only there to, when the big story breaks, and you're not there before, you're not there after.
I would like to ask you, as a comm major, about the movement that kind of the field of journalism is taking right now, and the transition period that it's in, especially considering the crowdsourcing and the access to free data and amateur investigation going on. How do you, as someone who's kind of made it, so to speak, in the journalism industry, ensure that your stories are factual, are real, are things that can shed light on problems in the world that people need to see so that peace eventually can be achieved?
Well, the whole thing with, I guess you're touching on a couple different issues there. The idea of crowdsourcing and the other tools that we've seen that have come up, I think many of them can be very useful in reporting. It's just another, in effect, tool from your toolbox if you're in journalism. The bigger issue that people have been talking a lot about is that you know, what's going to happen to the journalists who have you know, spend their time in college and then went out and had some internships and then are out practicing the profession of journalism, when you have people who can come in who've never taken the journalism course in college or you know, haven't written before. But the whole issue of the bloggers and what impact that's going to have long term on the field. My basic belief is that I think over time we're right in this incredible new stage where we're all trying to feel what's going to work, and we're trying a lot of different things. In some cases, we're throwing a lot of things against the wall, and I think we'll see over time. These things take time to work themselves through, and you'll probably see that, you know, in some cases the good bloggers will remain, and the ones that are sort of, you know, just you know, calling it in and really doing a great job, they'll probably, you know, fade over time, and we'll come back to some kind of semblance of order, you know. But these things take time to work their way through, and as it's happening, there's a lot of contortion, there's a lot of angst, there's a lot of, you know, stress on a lot of sides, and many people saying that journalism dying. Journalism was dying. I was at a luncheon Monday, and I was sitting next to a guy named Stanley. He's sort of the grandfather of prepaid college loans. He started it in Florida, and it sort of spread around the country. And we were having a conversation about journalism, and he says to me, you know, it seems like newspapers are dying, and you know, I don't know what's going to happen to your industry. And I was trying to tell him this is an extremely exciting time to be a journalist, because, as I mentioned, we have all these new tools that we can use, but also there are so many incredible stories out there still happening every day that we can cover. And for me, who's covering the world, it's really an amazing place. I mean, you just look at what's happening today. You look at the Ukraine, you look at Venezuela, you look at the Middle East. I mean, everywhere you go, there are great stories breaking out, and I think the world needs people to cover those stories, and people who are responsible journalists, and people who can really tell and explain what's happening in such a way that people can really understand the context with which a lot of these things are taking place. And I think for that, you know, because of those kinds of things, you know, I think we'll be around for a very long time.
Exciting time that journalism is in. And you said that you've got new tools for the toolbox. I would like to ask you, you know, with those new tools comes new problems. And so with the emerging prominence of data-driven journalism, how do you see that changing or shaping the field?
Well, the new problem also comes new responsibility. That we also have a big responsibility to make sure that that what we're doing it in a way that's you know, that's responsible. But in terms of a lot of the data-driven, I think it gives people different ways to look at and to analyze the news and what's happening, and in a way that probably, you know, 10, 15 years ago that people hadn't even thought of. Let's look at the election last year. The presidential election. So much has happened. But you look at what was happening to the New York Times blog no, I can't remember his name, but he did a really terrific job of using data to be predictive of what will happen on election day. And it's the kind of stuff that, you know, someone hadn't really thought of doing, or even if someone had thought of doing it, it wasn't as easily accessible as it was. Silverman, I think was his last name, was able to do. And he's going off now. He's down at ESPN, and he's going to be using that same type of you know, data approach to sports, and he'll still also be doing politics. But it's the kind of stuff that I think is really important important. And when you look at what's happening, and I mentioned earlier that you'll find over time the good ones will hang around and some of the bad ones will go by the wayside. I think blogs like his are the ones that people will gravitate to. And as you find the masses gravitating to the really good ones, you'll find the ones at the edges. And which is sort of, to some extent, the same thing that's happening in the newspaper industry. Because, and going back to my conversation with Stanley, he said newspapers are dying. Well, in fact, he's right and he's wrong. The ones that are dying are the ones that had really bad models. And the ones that had those models, really, many of them have actually gone away. So the ones that have remained are the ones that are a lot stronger. But the newspapers that remain are very strong. And so my paper, the Miami Herald, is still making money, and a lot of newspapers around the country are still making money. We're not making as much as we used to, and except you're probably in the tech industry. That's not that's not the case. But the fact is, newspapers are going to be around for a very long time.
We have time for one or maybe two more before we should get Mr. Yearwood to his next engagement.
Let me just say this one thing about newspapers. I remember when I was in college, conservatively 25 years ago. I remember writing a paper in my journalism class about computers people were experimenting with computers, and I'm not sure if the internet was around. I don't remember. But for some reason, I did a paper about the fact that with this new technology just coming on, newspapers are going to go away, and so I predicted that 25 years ago, and I'm happy that I was wrong.
One question that I would like to ask you, and this may be on a more personal note, but what's one story that you broke, that you were passionate about, that you really felt deserved a certain amount of coverage, and it didn't go so well, and how did you handle that situation?
It didn't go so well.
It didn't receive maybe the coverage you thought that it should.
That I personally wrote?
Yes, sir.
Oh my gosh! When I was reporting, that goes way back. One thing that I was a reporter in Dallas, and I wrote about this this school that had, I think it was high school or elementary school, I don't remember, that had a problem with the sports program. For disabled kids, they played other disabled kids around the state. And the coach, what he did was that he went out and found kids that are actually able-bodied, and he put them, really good basketball players, and put them on the team and called them disabled. And they won everything, including the state championship, and as you might expect. And one of the parents, I believe it was a parent, we're talking 20 years ago or something, told me about it, and I sort of, after looking into it and talking to a bunch of people, I reported that. We reported, I think we put it on the front page of Dallas Morning News, and over time, the coach was fired, and they sort of revamped the program. But it took a while for something to happen, and there was a time when you thought, well, and the story didn't really blow up. You didn't have all the other media necessarily covering it. But compared to some other stories where you write or that you break and everyone is trying to break it after you, trying to get to it. But that was sort of a story where we're sort of told that alone, and at the end we were able to get some results. But it isn't something that everybody in town was talking about because everyone was reporting it. And I thought fine sometimes, but you know that what you did the, you know, in my case, you did the right thing by reporting on this. And in fact, some of the parents, specifically I remember some of the parents of the team, on the team, were really upset at me because it meant that their kids will have to give up the championship. And these are kids who were legit. There were some kids on the team who were legitimately disabled. You know, felt that they were going to have to give up the trophy and the championship that they won. But of course, you know, they won it through, in fact, fraud.